Yes. Uh, Good morning. First of all, on the behalf of Shahstri Institute, I welcome you to this broader discussion on the evolution of left and the ideas and its implication on politics and society. We just broadly discussed the evolution of left as an idea or as an ideology or as an thought. Um, Kedarji just explained that. What I'll be doing is I'll taking it further, but looking at the Indian experience of what the left was. Recently, in last year, that means December 2025, the Communist Party of India completed its 100 years. Uh, of course, none of us got to know much about it. There was not much enthusiasm about it. There was hardly anything to celebrate, frankly, because if you look at the downfall of political left, you will realize that over the years, the left's significance electorally has gone down substantially. But of course, 1925 is one estimate. If you ask within the broader left community, some of them will talk about the creation of Communist Party in 1920s when M.N. Roy founded its first Communist Party in Tashkent. Keeping the squabbles aside, I think it's safe to say that the first Communist Party of India established in 1925 in Kanpur, and it completed its 100 years. In what has been the journey of that 100 years, and how can we contextualize that journey through the ideological/tactical shifts that the communists have done in India? And what does it tell us about the left broader as an idea? So what I'll try to do is, Kedarji just introduced some of the basic premises of what Marxism is, what some of the basic hypotheses or some of the basic truisms that Marxism has always propagated. I'll take those three premises and test those premises through Indian experience. I mean, what has happened of those three lofty claims that Marxism has done when we test it? So what I'm trying to do is, I will look at how the case study itself becomes an examiner. You know, if you generally read Marxist literature, scholarly literature or polemics, either way, you will always see, India as a Indian Marxism in India as something been projected as one of the case studies of Marxism in colonial states, how colonial state Marxism has evolved. So I'm going to invert that logic and look at how this case study itself examines the broader meta theory of Marxism, or not theory, ideology of Marxism. But to do that, we have to first, Marxism projects itself as this meta ideology or meta worldview, which explains every single phenomenon of society, from politics to theater, from music to fashion. Marxism claims that it can explain every single phenomenon of society. That itself is a rich claim to make. But from where does claims like this emerge, and how do Marxists sustain this kind of logic, can be tested through his three very fundamental premises. So what are those three fundamental claims? The claim of universalism, that Marxism is a universal idea, which means the basic premises, the basic variables like class, variable like mode of production, variables like state, all these are trans-contextual, that they are relevant across all the areas, across all the societies. So there may be local variations here and there, but basically class remains class wherever you go. Whether you go to Moscow or Manchester, the class in itself will remain the same. And therefore the appeal to universalism is central to Marxism. And we'll see how this very fundamental premise falters when it interacts with India. Of course, I am taking Indian case study. You take any other example and I'm sure universalism will falter on its face. The second is the idea of scientific theory. Kedarji also just now mentioned that Marx prided himself that while socialism existed before him, he had actually provided a scientific way of analyzing society and then providing solutions to it. So it was not just an empty utopia. It was not based out of emotion. Marx was able to identify the broader grammar of society and now can actually explain what that entire structure is. So it's not a empty utopia, it is a scientific theory, and therefore it is applicable. All the Marxist discussion around will sort of brag about it being scientific, and other ideas like conservatism, for example, rely so much on beliefs, abstractions, and so on. We'll test to what extent this really is scientific. One of the Karl Popper, famous philosopher, once said that one of the very basic preconditions of something being science is that there should be some element of falsifiability. That in some context at least, the theory should have a possibility of it not being true, so that there can be an evolution within that scientific domain. What we see in Marxism is something that we'll try to look in through our examples also, that whenever Marxism thinks that it is faltering, it just changes the story. It just changes the narrative. So it's almost like a faith. You cannot prove it wrong. It always has to be right. And we will see how to make it right. Marxism has always tailored itself, changed its course, made flip-flops, only to ensure that the grand old theory sustains in real world. So we'll test the second very significant hypothesis of it being scientific. And third, the idea of this historical inevitability, this teleological obsession which Marxism has, that history is predetermined, that history takes a peculiar path, and it is always going to take that path. It may take time, it may take its own merry time, but it will eventually result into some sort of a predetermined outcome, that there is going to be so that teleological obsession will also test that what happens when history doesn't follow that path, or what happens when history reverses its path. We have seen in the case of disintegration of Soviet, the entire idea was that once the Soviet or the socialism is achieved, it is irreversible. You cannot reverse the process. So how did Indian left explain the disintegration of Soviet and the popularization of liberal democracies in pre-Soviet countries? So we'll test these three hypotheses and see if Marxism really is what it claims to be. And we will use two explanatory variables. See, let's try, if we have to sort of puncture some of the scientific claims of Marxism, we might as well use certain scientific methodology as well. We'll use two explanatory variables to understand if all the claims of Marxism is true or not. The first variable is colonialism, Indian national movement, and the ideas of Indian Republic. How did Marxism or Indian Marxists / communists give this very fundamental process of colonialism, decolonization, national movement, and the emergence of Indian Republic? And the second very fundamental and central question is on the concept of revolution. What did Indian communists talk about the idea of revolution? We will look at these two explanatory variables and try to understand if all these premises of Marxism stand or not, which is why I've used the term transmogrification. It may sound condescending, some may think that it is slightly derogatory, but if you look at the way Marxism and communist parties in India have evolved, you will realize that at one point in time, it's not even funny to the time they have changed their course and the explanations they have given to their own logics. And the time difference between one logic and the other logic is days. In one day they are saying something, and it's 2 days their entire logic gets inverted. That is something that we will try to understand through these ideas. Now, all that I'm going to say today is going to be from the documents of CPI, Communist Party of India, the documents, the party resolutions, the party programs, and everything and anything that is going to come up today is everything is coming from their own documents. So we're trying to read those documents, we're trying to make sense of those ideas and see what Marxism really means. But let's begin from Marx himself. Of course, colonialism was a devastating phenomenon, and the entire Marxist clique actually prides itself for producing one of the fiercest critiques of colonialism, whether it is colonialism emerging from the West or colonialism that has retained its course even after the end of Second World War. So one of the fiercest critiques of colonialism has come from Marxist ideologues. And that's true. It's not untrue that Marx has not critiqued, or Marxists have not critiqued colonialism, but so have others. I mean, we have conservative philosophers who have critiqued colonialism. We have liberals who have critiqued colonialism. So there's not something unique about Marxist critique. But look at what Marx is saying about India. This is what he says, that Indian society has no history at all. What we call its history is but the history of successive intruders who founded their empires on passive basis of that unresisting and unchanging society. This is Marx's interpretation of India, that India has no history, its people are passive, unresisting, and therefore its history is only the history of intruders. It's no surprise that Marxist historians teach us the same logic. But what is interesting is, this is rather rich from a man who's not even traveled to India, has no knowledge of any of the Indian languages, has no basis to determine whether this is right or not. What all he had was, he was primarily referring to East India Company records, the debates in House of Commons that were happening. And more importantly, by all means, we know that he was relying on James Mill. Not directly, we just saw how Marx plagiarized Hegel in a rather brutal way. Hegel was obviously heavily influenced by James Mill. James Mill was writing about history of British India, and if you read history of British India and then compare what Marx was writing, you can see a stark resonance to what he's saying. But this is what he's saying. But what I'm trying to, I want to draw your attention to is the later part. He says, the question therefore is not whether the English had right to conquer India, but whether we prefer India conquered by Turk, the Persian, the Russian, or eventually by Britain. So what is he saying? That, okay, anyway, India is going to get conquered, but the British colonialism is something which is good for India. British colonialism is something which is going to emancipate India eventually. Of course, he's saying that colonialism is bad, British colonialism has done problems to India, but he eventually justifies that this is what he says later on, that English dissolved a semi-barbarian, semi-civilized community. So India was a semi-barbarian, semi-civilized society, had no basis, had no modes of production, not a developed economy. And what Britain is going to do is going to introduce all these modern economic apparatus to India that will lead it to capitalism. And so England is going to fulfill double mission, a destructive mission that will destroy the primitiveness of India. And the regenerative parties, when capitalism emerges here, then it will eventually lead to socialism. So Marx is telling us that British colonialism is good for India. Not colonialism itself, but British colonialism is good for India. However, if that is the premise, how does this now, this is something, will test the first hypothesis of universalism. What was Marx's prediction about colonialism, primarily in the colonized society? That there are two ways these societies would emancipate. One, that there will be a revolution in Britain itself, and because there is a revolution in Britain, the colonized society will also be liberated. That obviously did not happen. And the second is that the capitalism will develop in colonized societies because of colonial intervention, and then there will be revolution in those colonized societies. That also obviously did not happen. So what happens is something you will now start seeing adjustment that Marxists do in India. First, there is all these explanations about colonized societies start failing. What then we say is, we see an effort within Indian communists to start delegitimizing all other movements that are trying to bring independence. Because independence is only, or liberation is only going to come through the Marxism. So all other ideas, all other norms, all other movements are delegitimized by Marxists. And we will see that primarily happens with regards to the Indian national movement, primarily led by Indian National Congress then, because it happened to be the single largest party present all across India. We see that Indian National Congress and the nationalist movement is delegitimized as a bourgeois movement, as a class-ridden movement, because nationalism itself for the Marxists nationalism itself was a superstructural illusion. Nationalism doesn't exist. What exists is only class consciousness. That happened. Then we, in fact, had a very famous debate between M.N. Roy and Lenin in the second Comintern, what is to be done on the colonial question. But Indian Marxists were thinking in one direction. Lenin, who had actuated a revolution in Russia, obviously was preoccupied by some other things. So Lenin then wasn't much interested in ensuring that the similar revolution happens in India as well. So the debate between M.N. Roy and Lenin happens. M.N. Roy is saying that we should translate the revolution, the Russia-like revolution in India. We should have a similar vanguard, which is the Communist Party in India, and then that will create an alternative independent state. Lenin is saying, no, right now India is not prepared. Indian working class is not ready. What you should do is rather co-opt yourself in the national movement, and when the time comes, then you can go for a full-fledged revolution. So there is a first tactical adjustment that happens that, okay, if there is a nationalist movement, you use that movement for mass organization, for popularizing your ideals. You'd never completely become one, because this is still a bourgeois leaders. It is still a semi-feudal society. But you can use this nationalist movement to popularize your ideas. That second debate, of course, there were differences that continued. M.N. Roy presented his thesis, Lenin presented his thesis, and then there was some sort of agreement, and then the common draft came out where on the colonial question, there was some sort of tactical adjustment. But again, what we see here is Indian communist movement is never Indian. In fact, no communist movement is ever a national communist movement. It is, the claim is internationalism, that there is some international solidarity, and that solidarity somehow was centered around what was happening in Soviet. So everyone in even Indian communist movement was under the tutelage of Soviet ideas, under the tutelage of what was happening in Soviet Russia then. And a lot of developments within India are actually controlled, directed by what was happening in Soviet Union. We see that happening very strongly in 1941-42, when the Communist Party in India first were opposing colonial state because Soviet was against colonialism. But when Hitler actually invades Soviet Union, suddenly that colonial war becomes a people's war, and the communist parties in India decide not to go against Britain because Britain was in alliance with Soviet Union. This happened in the matter of months. A telegram comes and the Indian Communist parties overnight decide that the imperial war is now the people's war. Has colonial state changed? It had not. Indian realities had changed? They didn't. What was changed was there was a direction from Soviet Union, and we see that happening across. So a sense of subservience is seen in entire Indian communist discussions to its masters, high masters, somewhere in Soviet Union, and later on we will see that happens with China as well. But while this is happening on one level, the communist insurrection is still attempted. Telangana was an example. Of course, the communists in India would romanticize the Telangana struggle as if something ushering a new ideal, but Telangana insurrection failed miserably. The leaders were arrested, some of them were killed, incarcerated, the party was banned, so on and so forth. So insurrection essentially failed. So when that happens, the next thing that Marxists do is, now firstly they were delegitimizing Indian national movement, now they start delegitimizing the Indian independence itself. Now, the line that the communists take is Indian independence is sham. That this is not a true independence. This is not a real independence. Real independence can come only when there is a people's revolution. Now, these are quotes which are so how did they classify Indian independence? It was sham. It was incomplete. Indian constitution was called as a slave constitution, a class-ridden constitution, a bourgeois constitution. And Indian Republic as a state, as a class state, is not a genuinely proletarian state. And these are not my reflection. These are actual terms which the Communist Party has used in number of their deliberation and party documents. Now, this is B.T. Ranadive, one of the General Secretaries of Communist Party of India. In 1949, this is what he writes to Mao Zedong then, that the toiling masses of India feel jubilant over this victory. This victory in the sense, the communist revolution in the Maoist China then. That the Indian masses are jubilant on it, They know that it hastens their own liberation, that the revolutionist China is going to hasten revolution in India. This is what BTR is talking about. They are inspired by it to fight more determinedly and courageously their battle for ending the present regime. What was the present regime? The nationalist government, which was coming in the center. So there is a sort of subservience of Indian revolution, quote unquote, to the Chinese revolution, and there will be a people's democracy or rule of people's democracy in China. This is General Secretary of CPI, 1949, writing letter to Mao Zedong. This doesn't change. In 1950, this is what was then called as the Randive line. There are multiple lines. There is Randive line, Andhra line, Calcutta line. So there are multiple. We'll tell you how many times communists themselves have tried to adjust to realities. But in 1950, this is what CPI document says. It says the Nehru government was an agent and junior partner of imperialism and therefore had to be overthrown immediately to establish worker-peasant rule. This is in 1950. On one hand, there is a Constituent Assembly trying to build a consensus around Indian Constitution, and this is Communist Party of India saying that we need insurrection against the Indian state. And this is one thing, one thing that communists across the world have in common is, they may be squabbling among themselves, which is right, which is wrong, is Leninism right or Stalinism right? They may be squabbling for n number of things within themselves. But one thing that unites communists across the globe is the contempt they have for alternative viewpoints, the disregard that they have, the intolerance that they have for alternative viewpoints. Now, obviously, they do not approve of conservatives. They were not approving of conservatives within and outside the Congress. They were not approving of liberals within and outside the Congress. But they were not even approving of the socialists who sort of moved away from their line of thinking. So if you agree with us, you are with us. If you don't agree with us, you are basically class enemies. So you will see this happening. Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, and other socialists who thought that probably we don't need a revolution were all called as bourgeois class enemies by the Communist Party of India. This is what is in 1950. In 1951, again, the complete national... So in 1950, I'll briefly paraphrase what this is saying is, they're saying that national independence can come only when there is a people's government. And what is an indication? That government will have ties with genuine democratic countries like Soviet Union and People's Republic of China. Now, how is this a measure of democracy? I mean, they are saying that you will be a true democracy if you have good ties with Soviet and China. You already know that who is governing the behavior of Communist Party within India. And that is something a very common line within the Commons. Again, in 1951, CPI is saying that this constitution cannot be called as a democratic constitution. It is a constitution of landlord capitalist. Later on, they go on say, this is in 1951. Later it is in 1952. They reiterate their position that parliamentary democracy is problematic. 52. Remember, they are still contemplating fighting elections. On one hand, this is what they are telling to rest of the world. In 1954, they've already fought one election. So in 1952, the first general election, Communist Party was part of that election. It lost miserably. So when they lost the election miserably, this is what the party program says. Our program clearly states that the constitution is a deception and through its working class cannot come to power. So it is not merely a question of only winning election. Of course, if you win elections, then democracy is good. If you are losing out elections, then basically the democracy is a deception. 54, after fighting the elections, they are still talking about their line of insurrection, that we need a mass struggle and we need to overthrow the Indian state. But then something changes. 1957 is the first, and the same position was reiterated in 1956 as well. In 1956 party program, the CPI reiterated the position that Indian democracy is sham and the constitution is bourgeois constitution. But in 1957, they contest election and they win election in Kerala. This is for the first time the communists taste power within India and the line changes. After that, you will see that the shrill criticism that the communists had for in Indian election starts to go down. So, we see now a chronology samjhiye. You look at what is happening here. In 1949, there is a failed insurrection in Telangana. They realize that people don't support them. then there is a continuous delegitimization of Indian constitution. No one is giving two hoots to what they are saying. So now they reconvene and go back to their grandfathers and forefathers. The CPI actually went to Soviet Union, discussed this matter and what is to be done, how to now address the question of Indian problem. And the Soviet then tells them that, no, this is not the line. You cannot carry out a pan-India revolution. But instead, start accommodating yourself in the democratic process. But this is a tactical line. Soviet Union says that this is only for temporal purpose, that you participate in elections, participate in mass organizations, use all the democratic means, but the purpose is to subvert the democracy. So now elections are not problematic. You have to participate in elections, but the objective of revolution is not to be forgotten. So the line changes, and CPI then starts to make amendment to its own behavior and tries to adjust to Indian realities. For the rest of the world, India is priding itself. The rest of the world, India is that this is the first communist government which came to power through ballot and not bullets, and this all romantic ideas basically has no basis. Of course, that 1957 government did not last long. Nehru eventually overturned that government, and when that happened, obviously democracy was again in shatters. But what you see is that there is a conscious movement to accept Indian democracy, not because it is a genuine democracy, but you can use the democratic means to further your revolution. This is a very conscious, and we don't have time right now, but I have read party programs after party programs who say the same line, that this was called as a tactical change, or what was agrarian question. They have multiple party documents which say that you have to use these because it's not possible to have a countrywide revolution in India. So you will have to prepare yourself for that. So their participation in democracy is not a consequence of their faith in democracy, is a consequence of their tactical readjustment to Indian realities, which is why it's difficult to trust what communists were saying in 1950 and what communists are saying even today. Because we will see later on, this line has not changed even today. We may think that this is 1957, they have participated in elections, they participate in all sorts of things, but the line in itself has not changed. So there was a significant tutelage from Soviets. Soviet intervenes here to make sure that Communist Party in India is not completely outcast. What has happened again? This is another change, that all that we talk about universalism again fades here. And more importantly, Soviet realizes that India is a good strategic partner. India can be good check against expansion of capitalism in South Asia. The approach of Soviet towards India changes. It now starts looking at India as a prospective partner in diplomacy. So Soviet Union changes its line for insurrection, and therefore CPI changes its line of tactical adjustment to Indian democracy. There is no change of heart. There is no reassessment of realities. There is only reassessment of their own tactics. So Soviet tutelage was always very significant up until 1960s in deciding what was the attitude of Communist Party. Later on, China also emerges there. But what is happening here is, internationally there is one direction, and Indian Communist parties are following that direction and then making adjustment to their own realities as well. Now, there is next question. We looked at the idea of colonialism, how Marxism and Marxists themselves viewed colonialism and the question of decolonization, and as a afterthought, the idea of Indian national movement also. The second important variable to understand is, what about the revolution? Revolution is present out there for communists. Communism will cease to exist if it is not preoccupied with revolution. So revolution is always somewhere on the high side. But what happened to the whole idea of Indian revolution? Has the communist parties in India given up? The popular line is, okay, there is a CPI Maoist. That CPI Maoist is now given up democratic means and is fighting a war against Indian state. But the other legal communist parties are participating in elections, they are contributing in democratic process, so on and so forth. So have they given up the idea of revolution entirely? What is behind this? To understand this, you have to understand this phenomenon of three loyalty problem. No, communism or the communists within India, and I'm sure similar behavior is communist in different parties as well, have a fundamental problem of overlapping loyalties. Now, the first loyalty always is towards the ideology. The first fidelity is towards ideology. That ideology which emerges from the text of Marx, the text of Lenin, the first fidelity is to that phenomenon, that you have whatever is written in ideology, whatever is given in the book must be followed in toto, and that is how it will proceed as well. Then the next problem or the next loyalty is towards the foreign center. See, Indian communists have always behaved like provincial office of an international church. That the international church is somewhere in Soviet Union earlier. Later on, it shifted to China for some. And Indian Communist Party is its provincial office, its regional office. So it has to take orders from the headquarters. And of course, Indian communists are not shying away from saying that. They have multiple times said that this is what is the reality. So the second loyalty is towards the foreign center. And how do we understand it? One example was obviously the changing of the entire line of narrative during the 1941-42, when the Second World War was at its peak, and the imperial war overnight became a people's war because Soviet Union directed all communist parties in colonial state not to oppose Britain. Remember, it's not that the Communist Party just did not participate in freedom struggle. The Communist parties opposed the freedom struggle as well. The Communist parties very strongly advocated their peasants and all the others not to go against Britain because Britain was fighting with Soviet Union against. Then suddenly fascism was, or Nazism was, much immediate threat. And third, so loyalty to foreign, you will see that happening in 1942. Another very interesting example is what happened in 1964. No, earlier there was only one communist party, the CPI. Then how did CPIM came about? One is, obviously, there is internal squabbling. Then, in fact, by any account, at any given point in time, you at least had 20 different communist outfits. And I'm saying this number conservatively, there would be definitely much more. But the first major split happens in 1964. Earlier, the Soviet Sino split had happened. That means the death of Stalin posed a question of who is going to lead international communism now. The next, Khrushchev, who came, started the process of de-Stalinization. That means he was trying to purify some of the excesses of Stalin. Mao Zedong saw this as a travesty. How can someone defy Stalin? That started schism within the international communist movement, and Mao Zedong then conceives that it will now lead the battle of international communism. The Soviet Union by then had becoming introvert. It was not interested in, it was interested in fighting the Cold War, but was not interested in proliferating revolution in other states. So the radicals within the CPI now see that Soviet Union is becoming soft. The more radical version was emerging in China. So the supporters of Chinese faction, supporters of more radical element within the CPI, then start moving out of the CPI and they form their own party, which was Communist Party of India, Marxist. So first split happens. This split is happening again, not just because of what was happening internally, but what was happening internationally. So CPM started pledged their fidelity more to China. The CPI had by then become an almost a passive power, was not interested in openly in revolution, and towed the line of Soviet Union that you participate in democratic processes. So what was happening internationally was deciding the course of Communist Party within India also. And third, now this is another interesting flip-flop that you will see. 1991, 1990, 1991, the Soviet Union starts to disintegrate. But the process obviously began much earlier. The Gorbachev, the entire economic reforms, the glasnost, openness within the Soviet Communist Party had already weakened the iron fist of Communist Party of Soviet Union in Russia, Soviet then. And there was a coup against Gorbachev. So the disintegration process started with the coup against then the supreme leader of Soviet Union, who was leading all these reforms. When that coup happened, you look at the reaction of Indian communists. All of them were saying that finally there is rolling back. The going of Gorbachev is a reassertion of socialism being still active. The hardliners who were coming to target Gorbachev were seen as saviors of socialism. They were writing letters, they were writing articles after articles that how this is a triumph of socialism. That disintegration or the socialism dying in Soviet Union is basically a myth. That is what was being projected. That they also prophesize, the communist parties or communist individuals in India prophesize that there's going to be a mass awakening, Gorbachev is going to go down, and there will be a reassurance of communist rule in Soviet Union. What happens in reality, in a matter of 3 days, the whole coup disappears. The Elstine who comes in Russia is much more popular, bans Communist Party in Soviet Union, and the entire dream about socialism being reignited in Soviet Union disappears in a matter of 3 days. And you will now see that the entire Communist parties change their course in 3 days. 3 days before, they were talking about Gorbachev as this culprit and there's going to be a savior. In 3 days later on, you will see some sympathies emerging. Because what is happening here is, if you trust Marx, socialism is irreversible. How can, once you have attained socialism, you cannot go back to history? That is not possible in Marxist theory. What was happening in Soviet Union was basically a biggest slap to Marxism. The socialism which has emerged in Soviet Union was actually giving way to liberal democracies. This was unthinkable. So the Marxists and communists within India toil hard to show how this is basically a bourgeois conspiracy, an imperial conspiracy. This has been instigated from outside. If you read the literature and the turns and flip-flops that communists have done in the matter of 1 week, it's not even funny. The way they have changed their side. So you will always see that their second loyalty is towards their foreign centers, from where they get their tutelage, from where they get their direction. And if at all after this something is remaining, then there is fidelity towards Indian democracy. But remember, fidelity towards Indian democracy is tactical. It is not a genuine fidelity. It is not a genuine trust. And I'm not saying this by interpreting, I'm saying what they are actually saying themselves. From 1951 onwards, this tactical line of adjusting to Indian democracy was very much central to the entire Marxist discourse. So, the logic then was that if democracy fits the communist line, then it is good. If it doesn't fit the communist line, then basically democracy is in shambles. You will see this happening. So, if someone is winning elections in Kerala, the democracy is good in Kerala. But someone is winning elections in Maharashtra, in UP, then suddenly the democracy is in danger. This is not coincidental. This is by design. This is how communists have tried to delegitimize the institutions which were so strongly built through matter of consensus. But while to understand revolution, you have to understand this problem of royalty, that there are 3 royalty problems. But what it suggests is none of them had given up the dream of revolution. The revolution is not yet given up. Even if they are participating in elections, the idea of revolution has not been given up yet. So what we see is this, something which is happening, that discussions in CPI on how to proceed starts in 51. They go to Soviet Union. Stalin was present in those discussions, remember. And the communists themselves have said that Stalin was present in those discussions. And the discussion came to, the conclusion was that the CPI should participate in elections till the time revolution is on the horizon. So this tactical shift is something which is pertinent. Until then, what do? You combine all forms of struggle. You use mass struggle, you use legal struggle, you use electoral struggle, you use all avenues that a liberal democracy is giving you to basically undermine that democracy. You use all avenues to channelize a movement that will eventually overthrow that. This is something which communists have done since 1950s onwards. So they will use, for instance, they will use judicial processes for their own self. But if it doesn't suit them, then obviously judiciary is under threat. So let's say if there is a student leader, quote unquote student leader somewhere in Delhi who has been arrested for instigating riots in capital, and if the bail is rejected by the Supreme Court, then Indian judiciary is basically a bourgeois judiciary, is a class judiciary. But a Maoist who has been convicted somewhere near Gadchiroli is given bail on technical grounds. It was not a proof of the innocence, but it was given a bail on technical grounds. Then the entire judiciary is compromised. You will see that this continuously happens by design. You use judicial institution when it suits you, but the moment it creates problems, then the entire edifice, the entire ecosystem starts to delegitimize those institutions, and this happens by design. So communists are going to use all forms of democratic institutions to create to destabilize or delegitimize Indian democracy. Now, this was one idea. Of course, that was happening of the communist parties. This is what the communist parties were doing, ostensibly or apparently through democratic means. But then there was a branching out again within the Communist Party, and then there was a decisive turn towards Marxism-Leninism. See, some people very affectionately call it Naxalism, as if Naxalism is something different. See, well, if you call something Naxalism, you are euphemizing what is actually happening. It is nothing else than Maoism. It is a planned terrorism against the state, against its own people. So do not, you say Naxalism as something, a localized issue, an uprising that happened spontaneously for the rights of the peasant. It may be an element. Of course, communism and the communists are very good in instrumentalizing, weaponizing the tools and symbols. But make no mistake that the idea is Marxist, Leninist, Maoist. So what happens? That first break happens from CPI to CPM, Communist Party of India Marxists. They were radicals. They were not happy with the CPI line of accommodating too much, accepting Indian state. So that a new line emerges, which is CPI Marxist. But there were radicals within CPI Marxist also, who thought that this slow progress to revolution is not helping them. So the impatients and radicals within CPI form CPI Marxist. The further radicals within the CPI Marxist then form the CPI-ML. When, this CPI-ML, the Marxist-Lenin, is the first open organization that revolted against the Indian state, came out of CPI Marxist, but it came out much later when the Naxalbari outbreak came out. They came out because they were, firstly, the CPI, those radicals like Charu Mazumdar, they thought that when insurrection happens in Naxalbari, the CPI Marxist is going to support them. They did not get support from CPI Marxist. Of course, they already had tested power and they didn't want to give up power now. So the CPI Marxist decides not to support this outbreak, which is why the CPI, the entire Maoist wing, emerges from CPI-ML, and they say that this is too slow, this is too soft, we need to fasten the revolution, we need to bring revolution sooner than later. So the CPI Marxists then start becoming, or starts appearing softer when you compare it to the other radicals within the CPI-ML. And what does the CPI-ML says? That the CPI Marxist is semi-feudal. It is So this is a classic tactic. The Marxist within the CPI Marxists who wanted radical change, and the people who were not supporting that suddenly became semi-feudal, semi-colonial. The moment you disapprove with their line, you are a pariah. And then the CPI-ML gets formed. Charu Mazumdar, there's this new famous program that Charu Mazumdar started. He famously said that the Chinese chairman is Indian chairman. He wanted to give the leadership of Indian revolution to Mao Zedong also. And they start, what they say is that they start correcting the narrative. The CPI Marxist had sort of lost the flavor, and the CPI-ML is now going to correct this line. ostensibly say that this is a people's revolution, but primarily it was an ideologically driven battle for political purpose, and the entire model was the Chinese model. But remember, by that time, Soviet Union had lost interest in international revolution. Mao Zedong was still trying to project himself as a leader, so they openly adopt the Chinese line, and it becomes clear from their party documents how Maoists were central to their discussion. But in 2004, the Consolidated Vanguard was created, which basically was merger of different outfits here and there, as a CPI Maoist as the only consolidated vanguard of Indian revolution. So now what the picture is, so there is a democratic wing of communists who fight elections, who participate in democratic processes. So they are good communists. And then there's a CPI Maoist who is fighting the state. Now, obviously, this element is also almost gone. The CPI Maoist is almost obliterated in jungles. Whatever the remnants would be there in urban areas is a different issue. But these are the bad communists who are fighting the state. So there is a good communist, bad communist teleology that again comes up. Rishabh. But is this a radical rupture? Is this something which is, so are CPI Maoists different from the rest of the communists? Can we say that there is a rupture or there is just a doctrinal impatience? I think after reading at least CPI Marxist party programs, you will realize that CPI Marxist has yet not given up the idea of democracy. They have not rechanged its approach to Indian democracy. They still classify Indian state as a bourgeois state, and we can look at some of those a bit later. So what we see is there is just an impatience. CPI Maoists are more impatient. CPI Marxists are more patient and willing to give time for Indian revolution. So you do not see, there is a softening, but that softening is tactical. That softening is by design. That softening is not because there is a sudden faith in Indian democracy. And even the radicals within the CPI Marxists, you will see time and again they say things which sort of discomfort CPI Marxists. Recently, one of its Kerala leaders had said something about Indian constitution. CPI Marxist was forced to ask the resignation. But if you read their party program, they are basically saying nothing different. So what you see basically is the idea of revolution is not given up. The mode, the mechanisms and process to attain it is only changing. CPI Maoists is much more impatient. The Marxists are ready to wait till the time comes. What is still common in them? The assessment of Indian state. Indian state is still semi-feudal, semi-colonial, is not a true democracy. And if you look at Indian state as like this, you're basically coming to a same conclusion. However, the modus operandi may change. And how do we know this? This is a 2016 or 2018 CPI Marxist document. What they are doing is they are comparing the party program of CPI, which was pro-Soviet and pro-Russia, and the CPM. And the way they are talking about CPI will tell you what CPI Marxists are actually thinking. Now, this is what the document says. There's a clear and fundamental difference between the approach of CPI and the understanding of CPM. And what is that fundamental approach? CPI does not believe, as CPIM does, that it is absolutely essential to replace present state headed by big bourgeois with people democratic state. So what it is saying, CPIM still believes that you have to replace the state. But the earlier CPI somehow given up on that goal, which is a major bone of contention between these two political parties. This is evidence in how the CPI sees parliamentary democracy as an instrument for effecting transformation in society. So CPI, which thinks that you can use parliamentary democracy, is basically astray. CPI Marxist still has no faith in parliamentary democracy. It is only tactically using Indian institutions for the objective of ushering in revolution. And further it goes on to say the legacy of viewing Indian state structure as containing anti-imperial, anti-monopoly and anti-feudal potential, which was present in 1964 program, continues. So what CPI Marxist is saying, that CPI believes that India has tendency to be anti-colonial, which CPIM doesn't believe in. So the CPI Marxists, make no mistake, is still considering Indian state as a feudal, colonial, and therefore a necessity of revolution within that. So where does this then brings us? How do we We began by testing these three hypotheses, that if we test the universalism, the historical inevitability and scientific nature of communism, we see that it falters on almost all fronts. We have seen how it had changed. There was never a universalism. Marx took one line, Lenin took entirely other. The Stalin then changed it. And based on it, Indian communists were changing line to the point that at one time there was a people's war and then there was an imperialist war. Historical inevitability doesn't come through. Even the socialism, whatever was there in India in the economic realm, was actually was dismantled by the very party which institutionalized socialism in India. So the whole myth that history is irreversible, once you arrive at socialism, there is no going back, is basically a myth. And less is said about scientific attitude, the better. Because at every point, if you were a scientific, you would look at data and probably make amends to your theory. What is happening here is you look at data, you don't amend the theory, you start interpreting reality to suit your theory. You're basically hogwashing and not really. So the whole idea about being scientific, the whole idea about being universal, the whole idea that there is an historical inevitability that works behind the scene is basically a sham. It is an ideological project driven to bring about power through bullet, and they are using multiple ways to go about it. So what we see today is, electorally, obviously, communism is dying. The last time communism had some decent number was in 2004, somewhere around 54, 55 numbers. Today it has come down to 8. The entire left unity. But the doctrine refuses to die. The doctrine, if you read 2025 party document of CPIM, which is available online, you will see what I'm trying to say. So what they are doing is they are identifying new theaters of conflict. They're identifying areas where they can wage struggle, which then will provide legitimacy to their political movement also. And what are these? Your academic institutions, your academia, your social spaces, all these are targeted in order to provide legitimacy to a dying idea, which otherwise electorally is already dead. In fact, this is what CPIM said in 2025, in December 2025, that their priority is to strengthen the party, but also to revive the strength of left unity. And how is going to happen? By united left campaigns and struggle, which highlights the alternative politics of. And what is this alternative politics? You will see the communist parties or these communist outfits engaging themselves in all sort of struggles. If you would have probably, when this whole Marathi agitation was going on, the imposition of Hindi, you will see how different communist parties became part of it. Not because they have love for Marathi. If you look at what the communists have done to the local languages wherever they came to power, you will be ashamed to see what the communists do. But wherever there is a challenge to a state, the communists are trying to integrate themselves in order to create a mass movement and thereby give legitimacy to their dying. And this is what they said in 2025. The party should therefore work to rally all left and democratic forces, including mass organization, social movements, and progressive intellectuals for a democratic platform. So I'll leave you with this snippet. This was something which was shared by Communist Party of India, West Bengal, a Twitter snippet where what is CPI Marxist saying? They are celebrating the great revolutionary, which is Stalin, and they are hoping that Stalin is going to lead them, the memory of Stalin is going to lead them towards an idea of free, or whatever that, a world free from injustice, discrimination. Now, this is what ideological blinkers do to you. If you cannot see what Stalin really was, he was the worst dictator of contemporary political times, under whom people died not just because of starvation or enforced droughts, because of forced incarceration, extrajudicial killings. You idolize that person as someone who is going to bring freedom and and do away with injustice, will tell you what kind of party that has become and what kind of ideals that party. So what we see is communism in India is no longer a central actor in politics. It's not a central actor, but it persists instead as a subtle corroding influence of our democratic. It is working as a poison within the veins of Indian Republic. It is trying to destabilize India from within. And working against what it could not decisively throw out. So they're trying to delegitimize and overrun Indian democracy from within, something they tried to do from outside. They did not succeed. Now they're using all the means to delegitimize Indian state. So if you look at the transmogrification that has happened from being an anti-imperial force to now being a force which is trying every means to completely destabilize a functioning democracy and creating distrust among people about our own institution, is something that all of us should be worried about. And to do that, what we see now is that left has entered the realm of culture, which is far more problematic. Something that all of us has to be wary about, how all our cherished institutions, whether it's a society, family, individual, religion, culture, everything has been targeted to ensure that the dead ideology somehow resurrects. But if you look at that picture, I think that is an evidence in itself. So I'll rest my case there. I mean, we'll be happy to discuss after that. Okay. If you have any question, yeah. Yes. Yes.
So a couple of days back, we have had another conference of Shahstri Research Institute on Maoism and state response. The problem that you highlighted is because we can visibly see political outfits are saying what they believe. But there is another problem that was discussed that day as well, wherein that senior journalist who came, he said that while the state is rehabilitating the Maoist ideologues into the governmental institutions by upskilling them, giving them a menial skill and then a job, we can see these people on the top level because they are visible. But the government in itself is taking initiatives to make these people into the governmental institutions and giving them jobs. So it becomes very blurred to identify them at the ground.
Yeah. So this is what is the problem, and the problem that you highlighted is significant. What for those who might not have been able to hear, I'll just rephrase what he was asking. There's a massive surrender drive that is happening of the Maoists across India. Indian state is providing them an avenue to rehabilitate themselves, to give up their arms. And what if these then use Indian social institution to wage a different kind of war against India? How do we identify them? Now, it's difficult to identify. It's not easy. So Indian state and Indian civil society both has to be vigilant. But that is the beauty of Indian democracy. I mean, we do not begin from the premise of distrust. We begin from the premise of, okay, everyone has a right to participate in political, social life. That is the premise of Indian democracy. And that is the basic ethos of any democracy. Why just Indian? So we begin from the position of trust, which is why it is all the more, state can be present only to a point. If civil society is vigilant, then a lot of these issues will be addressed at that level itself, which is why it is important to understand the design, the logic. It's not coincidental that there are mass struggles emerging in different corners. There's a design. If you understand the design, if you are able to differentiate between what is a genuine protest and what is an instigated one, and frankly, once you understand their logic, once you start reading their literature, it becomes easy to identify that, which is why it is important to, if we understand that design, then we will be able, and I think Indian as a society is far more resilient. As a society, as a community, we are far more resilient to these notorious forces. Of course, it's not an excuse for complacency, but I think that is the only thing that we can say, that it is hard to identify, but a lot of this onus lies in civil society. Yes.
So we've seen this common feature throughout the world universally, how communism becomes a very attractive ideology or a attractive philosophy to students in premier campuses. This happens in, not just to give examples, JNU in India, it happens in Harvard in the US.
Yeah.
And this happens with students who consider themselves as elite sections of society or highly educated. So why does this happen? How should we prevent it? And if you can decode it a little better, what should be done about it?
Well, it's a question I've been teaching at university. So this phenomenon is obviously no alien. But no, communism comes up with an appeal. See, all said and done, who doesn't want a good society? If I tell you that I'm going to bring an equal society. Everyone will be free. You can do whatever you want. And there are some things which the communist propagator is not right for me to say from this platform. So if it is propagating a certain kind of freedom, it obviously becomes an attractive ideology. But, what has happened is the cycle perpetuates because by design, the left captured the institutions. By design, left ensured that they will penetrate in institutions through which they can create an alternative politics. So it's not, isn't it strange? I mean, look at this phenomenon. Most of our social science institutions are populated by Marxists, and all these extremely dangerous ideas are propagated as emancipatory, are propagated as something that is going to liberate you. And history is there to prove you to sort of prove you otherwise, but still it persists because there is left understood the importance of narratives and institutions way before anyone else could. When conservatives were talking about building society, ensuring an order, the left were already they were thinking 30 years from now how this idea is going to get. Now, just to give you an instance, Marxism, we all know Marxism criticized colonialism. Of course, it theoretically criticized, provided a very scathing critique of colonialism. But have you heard in your academia the conservative criticisms of colonialism? There's a very strong conservative criticism of colonialism. Liberals were Edmund Burke, for instance, criticized British colonialism. Of course, he ended up supporting colonial state for a different reason. But if you read the scathing critique of Edmund Burke of British colonial state on colonialism, it's very academic in nature. Liberals were criticizing colonialism. But the moment you say anti-imperial, the moment you say anti-colonial, you will associate yourself with something left. Take another instance. This whole revolutionary, this idea of revolutionary, there was a time was associated only with the left anarchist revolutionaries. It is a sham. How can any ideology appropriate revolutionaries? We had revolutionaries of off-use, they were nationalists. We had revolutionaries who, they were agitationists like satyagrahis. But the moment you say revolutionaries, this is how the left has controlled the narrative. They have ensured that institutions will propagate their ideas, and all said and done, in 16, 17, 18 years, all of us want to be a bit rebellious. Who doesn't like to rebel against the norm? I think that is a sentiment which is captured by the left, which is what retains. But because nothing shines better than light. If you can shed light on these atrocities, I think it can work in favor also. So that could be one of the reasons.
So if I may be allowed a small follow-up on that, a very small one.
Yeah, quickly, yeah.
So later on, we've also seen, again, in relation to young people following communism, how it has kind of evolved into unnatural alliances or a different kind of, what should I say? Again, I'll use the same word that you did, transmogrification.
Yeah.
Into something called wokeism. Yeah. Does leftism have a role to play in it ideologically?
Yeah.
And certain unnatural alliances, including support for certain far-right outfits, as I would describe it, certain radical Islamist violent organizations as well at the campus level. So what is the reason when far left becomes indistinguishable or a partner of the far right?
Yeah.
And also certain people who call them left liberals are rising now, and they're completely distinct ideologies.
Well, left liberal is an oxymoron. Left and liberals cannot coexist. There were times when left would frown to be identified as liberals. Now, obviously, you have to be relevant, so you identify yourself with liberal. But left liberal as an idea itself is an oxymoron. But what you point out is important. Wokeism is appropriated by the left. It began with an extremely potent identity politics emerging as an offshoot of liberals in 70s, 80s. But this is what is significant. Left identifies the fault lines in society and appropriates those fault lines. So if you see there is a gender issue, the left will appropriate it. If you'll see there is a communal issue, the left will appropriate it. You have to understand what is called as dialectics of perpetual conflict. One thing that left is never satisfied is with reform. For example, if there was a demand for decriminalization of homosexual relations, 377 were decriminalized. Okay, that was a major cry for that. The moment that happens, the goalpost is now changed. No. That is fine. Now we want to legalize same-sex marriages. If that is achieved, then okay, fine. Then we have to move to, then there should not be monogamous marriage. So every time what you will see is the goalpost changes for the left. And the purpose is that they will not rest till the point the institutions in which society trusts are completely either delegitimized or removed, because that is what is going to pave a way for revolution for them. So all this, what you say is an unnatural, for them is very natural and real. They have lost the battle on the battlefield. So they will use these different offshoots to create a sort of pan coalition against the state. So I don't think it is unnatural. It is very tactical and by design. Yes. Yes. Huh.
1975, in our preamble, socialist word introduced.
Yeah.
So was it influence of communist ideology?
No doubt. Yes. In fact, if you look at the survival of Indira Gandhi's government then, was heavily reliant on the communist support. They used to be called as young Turks in Congress then, who realized that being part of Communist Party is not winning them elections, so they participate in Congress and use it to get the socialist ideas come through. Indira Gandhi used it for its advantage during the emergency, but also realized the dangers of it. And if you look at the next Indira Gandhi's tenure, she was moving already towards a more modernist, open economy. But the danger is, while this is what was happening in Congress in 70s, current Congress is again taking the same direction. If you look at the current Congress caucus and narratives and issues that is picking up, there is a deja vu of what was happening then, which is why probably it is also not electorally relevant that much. Yes, I will have one question because we now have a next session. Yes.
Stalin communist.
No.
It is influenced because of Russia or China.
So communism itself doesn't exist much in Russia, frankly. I mean, Putin detests communists. If you, it's a different debate altogether. But see, the Communist Party of Soviet Union was banned by Yeltsin after disintegration, and it had given up the whole romanticism about international revolution. Soviet then, communists, the CPIM continues to look at China as its forefather. How much it influences is a different issue, but I'm sure. In fact, there was a book by one of our former foreign secretary who alluded to something, how Chinese government was using Communist Party of India, Marxist, during the nuclear deal to jeopardize that nuclear deal. That time, if you remember, Manmohan Singh government was heavily reliant on the Communist Party of India. So they may use certain avenues like this. But even Xi Jinping has also been on and off. It first wanted to export revolution outside China, but there are internal problems in China right now. If you look at the purges that are happening and everything. So while the, what you call that not exist, that CORD exists, all these are their forefathers. This is 2021 Twitter. So they all see them as their forefathers, but the active support can come more from China and not from the Russia. All right, we'll stop here because we have a next session. We can take this discussion after the class, but thank you for patiently listening.